Chapter 30 of Men of Iron by Howard Pyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adjoining the ancient palace of Westminster, where King Henry IV was then holding his court, was a no less ancient stone building known as the Painted Room. Upon the walls were depicted a series of battle scenes in long bands reaching around this room, one above another. Some of these pictures had been painted as far back as the days of Henry III. Others had been added since his time. They chronicled the various wars of the King of England, and it was from them that the little hall took its name of the Painted Room. This ancient wing or offshoot of the main buildings was more retired from the hurly-burly of outer life than other parts of the palace, and thither the sick king was very fond of retiring from the business of state, which ever rested more and more heavily upon his shoulders, sometimes to squander in quietness a spare hour or two, sometimes to idle over a favorite book, sometimes to play a game of chess with a favorite courtier. The cold painted walls had been hung with tapestry, and its floor had been spread with arras carpet. These and the cushioned couches and chairs that stood around gave its gloomy antiquity an air of comfort, an air even of luxury. It was to this favorite retreat of the king's that Myles was brought that morning with his father to face the great Earl of Alban. In the anteroom, the little party of princes and nobles who escorted the father and son had held a brief consultation. Then the others had entered, leaving Myles and his blind father in charge of Lord Lumley and two knights of the court, Sir Reginald Hallowell and Sir Piers Averill. Myles, as he stood patiently waiting, with his father's arm resting in his, could hear the muffled sound of voices from beyond the arras. Among others, he recognized the well-remembered tones of the king. He fancied that he heard his own name mentioned more than once, and then the sound of talking ceased. The next moment the arras was drawn aside, and the earl entered the antechamber again.
"All is ready, cousin,"
said he to Lord Falworth in a suppressed voice.
"Essex hath done as he promised, and Alban is within there now."
Then turning to Myles, speaking in the same low voice, and betraying more agitation than Myles had thought it possible for him to show,
"Sir Myles,"
said he,
"remember all that hath been told thee. Thou knowest what thou hast to say and do."
Then, without further word, he took Lord Falworth by the hand, and led the way into the room, Myles following close behind. The king half sat, half inclined upon a cushioned seat, close to which stood the two princes. There were some dozen others present, mostly priests and noblemen of high quality, who clustered in a group at a little distance. Myles knew most of them at a glance, having seen them come and go at Scotland Yard. But among them all he singled out only one, the Earl of Alban. He had not seen that face since he was a little child, 8 years old, but now that he beheld it again, it fitted instantly and vividly into the remembrance of the time, of that terrible scene at Falworth Castle, when he had beheld the then Lord Brookhurst standing above the dead body of Sir John Dale, with the bloody mace clenched in his hand. There were the same heavy black brows, sinister and gloomy, the same hooked nose, the same swarthy cheeks. He even remembered the deep dent in the forehead, where the brows met in perpetual frown. So it was that upon that face his looks centered and rested. The Earl of Alban had just been speaking to some lord who stood beside him, and a half smile still hung about the corners of his lips. At first, as he looked up at the entrance of the newcomers, there was no other expression. Then suddenly came a flash of recognition, a look of wide-eyed amazement. Then the blood left the cheeks and the lips, and the face grew very pale. No doubt he saw at a flash that some great danger overhung him in this sudden coming of his old enemy, for he was as keen and as astute a politician as he was a famous warrior. At least he knew that the eyes of most of those present were fixed keenly and searchingly upon him. After the first start of recognition, his left hand, hanging at his side, gradually closed around the scabbard of his sword, clutching it in a vice-like grip. Meantime, the Earl of Mackworth had led the blind lord to the king, where both kneeled.
"Why, how now, my lord?"
said the king.
"Methought it was our young paladin, whom we knighted at Devlin, that was to be presented, and here thou bringest this old man. A blind man, huh? What's the meaning of this?"
Majesty,
said the earl.
I have taken this chance to bring to thy merciful consideration one who hath most woefully and unjustly suffered from thine anger. Yonder stands the young knight of whom we spake. This is his father, Gilbert Reginald, whilom Lord Falworth, who craves mercy and justice at thy hands.
"Falworth,"
said the king, placing his hand to his head.
"the name is not strange to mine ears, but I cannot place it. My head hath troubled me sorely to-day, and I cannot remember."
At this point, the Earl of Alban came quietly and deliberately forward.
"Sire,"
said he,
"pardon my boldness in venturing to address you, but haply I may bring the name more clearly to your mind. He is, as my Lord of Mackworth said, the whilom Baron Falworth, the outlawed, attainted traitor, so declared for the harbouring of Sir John Dale, who was one of those who sought your Majesty's life at Windsor 11 years ago. Sire, he is mine enemy as well, and is brought hither by my proclaimed enemies. Should aught occur to my harm, I rest my case in your gracious hands."
The dusty red flamed into the king's pale, sickly face in answer, and he rose hastily from his seat.
"Aye,"
said he,
"I remember me now. I remember me the man and the name. Who hath dared to bring him here before us?"
All the dull heaviness of sickness was gone for the moment, and King Henry was the King Henry of 10 years ago, as he rolled his eyes balefully from one to another of the courtiers who stood silently around. The Earl of Mackworth shot a covert glance at the Bishop of Winchester, who came forward in answer.
"Your Majesty,"
said he,
"here am I, your brother, who beseech you as your brother not to judge over hastily in this matter. It is true that this man has been adjudged a traitor, but he has been so adjudged without a hearing. I beseech thee to listen patiently to whatsoever he may have to say."
The king fixed the bishop with a look of the bitterest, deepest anger, holding his nether lip tightly under his teeth, a trick he had when strongly moved with anger, and the bishop's eyes fell under the look. Meantime the Earl of Alban stood calm and silent. No doubt he saw that the king's anger was likely to befriend him more than any words that he himself could say, and he perilled his case with no more speech, which could only prove superfluous. At last the king turned a face red and swollen with anger to the blind lord, who still kneeled before him.
"What hast thou to say?"
he said in a deep and sullen voice.
"Gracious and merciful Lord,"
said the blind nobleman,
"I come before thee, the fountainhead of justice, craving justice. Sire, I do now and here deny my treason, which denial I could not before make, being blind and helpless, and mine enemies strong and malignant. But now, sire, heaven hath sent me help, and therefore I do acclaim before thee that my accuser, William Bushy Buckhurst, Earl of Alban, is a foul and an unattainted liar in all that he hath accused me of. To uphold which allegation and to defend me, whom I am blinded by his unknightliness, I do offer a champion to prove all that I say with his body in combat.
The Earl of Mackworth darted a quick look at Miles, who came forward the moment his father had entered, and kneeled beside him. The king offered no interruption to his speech, but he bent a look heavy with anger upon the young man.
My gracious lord and king,
said Miles,
I, the son of the accused, do offer myself as his champion in this cause, beseeching thee of thy grace leave to prove the truth of the same, being a belted knight by thy grace, and of thy creation, and the peer of any who weareth spurs.
Thereupon rising, he drew his iron gauntlet from his girdle, and flung it clashing down upon the floor, and with his heart swelling within him with anger and indignation and pity of his blind father, he cried in a loud voice,
I do accuse thee, William of Alban, that thou liest vilely as aforesaid, and here cast down my gage, daring thee to take it up.
The Earl of Alban made as though he would accept the challenge, but the king stopped him hastily.
Stop!
He cried harshly.
Touch not the gage. Let it lie, I tell thee, my lord. Now then,
said he, turning to the others,
tell me what meaneth all this coil. Who brought this man hither?
He looked from one to another of those who stood silently around, but no one answered.
I see,
said he,
ye all have had to do with it. It is as my lord of Alban saith, ye are his enemies, and ye are my enemies as well. In this I do smell a vile plot. I cannot undo what I have done, and since I have made this young man a knight with mine own hands, I cannot deny that he is fit to challenge my lord of Alban. Nevertheless, the High Court of Chivalry shall adjudge this case. Meantime,
said he, turning to the Earl Marshal, who was present,
I give thee this attainted lord in charge. Convey him presently to the Tower, and let him abide our pleasure there. Also, thou mayest take up yon gage, and keep it till it is redeemed according to our pleasure.
He stood thoughtfully for a moment, and then raising his eyes, looked fixedly at the Earl of Mackworth.
I know,
he said,
that I be a right sick man, and there be some who are already plotting to overthrow those who have held up my hand with their own strength for all these years.
Then, speaking more directly,
my Lord Earl of Mackworth, I see your hand in this before all others. It was thou who so played upon me as to get me to knight this young man, and thus make him worthy to challenge my Lord of Alban. It was thy doings that brought him here today, backed by mine own sons and my brother, and by these noblemen.
Then turning suddenly to the Earl of Alban,
Come, my lord,
said he,
I am a-weary of all this coil. Lend me thine arm to leave this place.
So it was that he left the room, leaning upon the Earl of Alban's arm, and followed by the 2 or 3 of the Alban faction who were present.
Your Royal Highness,
said the Earl Marshal,
I must do the king's bidding and take this gentleman into arrest.
Do thy duty,
said the prince.
We knew it must come to this. Meanwhile he is to be a prisoner of honour, and see that he be well lodged and cared for. Thou wilt find my barge at the stairs, to convey him down the river, and I myself will come this afternoon to visit him.
End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Men of Iron by Howard Pyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was not until the end of July that the High Court of Chivalry rendered its judgment. There were many unusual points in the case, some of which bore heavily against Lord Falworth, some of which were in his favor. He was very ably defended by the lawyers whom the Earl of Mackworth had engaged upon his side. Nevertheless, under ordinary circumstances, the judgment, no doubt, would have been quickly rendered against him. As it was, however, the circumstances were not ordinary, and it was rendered in his favor. The court besought the king to grant the ordeal by battle, to accept Lord Falworth's champion, and to appoint the time and place for the meeting. The decision must have been a most bitter, galling one for the sick king. He was naturally of a generous, forgiving nature, but Lord Falworth in his time of power had been an unrelenting and fearless opponent, and his Majesty, who, like most generous men, could on occasions be very cruel and intolerant, had never forgiven him. He had steadily thrown the might of his influence with the court against the Falworths' case, but that influence was no longer all-powerful for good or ill. He was failing in health, and it could only be a matter of a few years, probably of only a few months, before his successor sat upon the throne. Upon the other hand, the Prince of Wales' faction had been steadily, and of late rapidly, increasing in power, and in the Earl of Mackworth, its virtual head, it possessed one of the most capable politicians and astute intriguers in Europe. So, as the outcome of all the plotting and counter-plotting, scheming and counter-scheming, the case was decided in Lord Falworth's favor. The knowledge of the ultimate result was known to the Prince of Wales' circle almost a week before it was finally decided. Indeed, the Earl of Mackworth had made pretty sure of that result before he had summoned Miles from France. But upon the king it felt like the shock of a sudden blow. All that day he kept himself in moody seclusion, nursing his silent, bitter anger, and making only one outbreak, in which he swore by the Holy Rood that should Miles be worsted in the encounter, he would not take the battle into his own hands, but would suffer him to be slain, and furthermore, that should the Earl show signs of failing at any time, he would do all in his power to save him. One of the courtiers who had been present, and who was secretly inclined to the Prince of Wales' faction, had repeated this speech at Scotland Yard, and the prince had said,
"That meaneth, Miles, that thou must either win or die."
"And so I would have it to be, my lord."
Miles had answered. It was not until nearly a fortnight after the decision of the Court of Chivalry had been rendered that the king announced the time and place of battle. The time to be the 3rd of September, the place to be Smithfield, a spot much used for such encounters. During the 3 weeks or so that intervened between this announcement and the time of combat, Miles went nearly every day to visit the lists in course of erection. Often the prince went with him. Always 2 or 3 of his friends of the Scotland Yard court accompanied him. The lists were laid out in the usual form. The true or principal list in which the combatants were to engage was 60 yards long and 40 yards wide, this rectangular space being surrounded by a fence about 6 feet high, painted vermilion. Between the fence and the stand where the king and the spectators sat, and surrounding the central space, was the outer or false list, also surrounded by a fence. In the false list, the constable and the marshal and their followers and attendants were to be stationed at the time of battle, to preserve the general peace during the contest between the principals. One day, as Miles, his princely patron, and his friends entered the barriers, leaving their horses at the outer gate, they met the Earl of Alban and his followers, who were just quitting the lists, which they also were in the habit of visiting nearly every day. As the two parties passed one another, the Earl spoke to a gentleman walking beside him, and in a voice loud enough to be clearly overheard by the others.
"Yonder is the young sprig of Falworth,"
said he.
"His father, my lords, is not content with forfeiting his own life for his treason, but must, forsooth, throw away his son's also. I have faced and overthrown many a better knight than that boy."
Miles heard the speech, and knew that it was intended for him to hear it, but he paid no attention to it, walking composedly at the prince's side. The prince had also overheard it, and after a little space of silence asked,
"Dost thou not feel anxiety for thy coming battle, Miles?"
"Yea, my lord,"
said Miles.
"Sometimes I do feel anxiety, but not such as my Lord of Alban would have me feel in uttering speech that he spake anon. It is anxiety for my father's sake and my mother's sake that I feel, for truly there are great matters for them pending upon this fight. Nevertheless, I do know that God will not desert me in my cause, for verily my father is no traitor."
"But the Earl of Alban,"
said the prince gravely,
"is reputed one of the best skilled knights in all England. Moreover, he is merciless and without generosity, so that an he gain aught advantage over thee, he will surely slay thee."
"I am not afraid, my lord,"
said Miles, still calmly and composedly.
"Nor am I afraid for thee, Miles,"
said the prince heartily, putting his arm as he spoke around the young man's shoulder.
"for truly, wert thou a knight of 40 years, instead of one of 20, thou couldst not bear thyself with more courage."
As the time for the duel approached, the days seemed to drag themselves along upon leaden feet. Nevertheless, the days came and went, as all days do, bringing with them at last the fateful 3rd of September. Early in the morning, while the sun was still level and red, the prince himself, unattended, came to Miles's apartment, in the outer room of which Gascoyne was bustling busily about, arranging the armor piece by piece, renewing straps and thongs, but not whistling over his work as he usually did. The prince nodded to him, and then passed silently through to the inner chamber. Miles was upon his knees, and Father Ambrose, the prince's chaplain, was beside him. The prince stood silently at the door, until Miles, having told his last bead, rose and turned towards him.
"My dear lord,"
said the young knight,
"I give you gramercy for the great honour you do me in coming so early for to visit me."
"Nay, Miles, give me no thanks,"
said the prince, frankly reaching him his hand, which Miles took and set to his lips.
"I lay bethinking me of thee this morning, while yet in bed, and so, as I could not sleep any more, I was moved to come hither to see thee."
Quite a number of the prince's faction were at the breakfast at Scotland Yard that morning, among others the Earl of Mackworth. All were more or less oppressed with anxiety, for nearly all of them had staked much upon the coming battle. If Alban conquered, he would be more powerful to harm them and to revenge himself upon them than ever, and Miles was a very young champion upon whom to depend. Miles himself, perhaps, showed as little anxiety as any. He certainly ate more heartily of his breakfast that morning than many of the others. After the meal was ended, the prince rose.
"The boat is ready at the stairs,"
said he.
"If thou wouldst go to the tower to visit thy father, Miles, before hearing mass, I and Chumley and Vere and Poins will go with thee. if ye, lords and gentlemen, will grant me your pardon for leaving you. Are there any others that thou wouldst have accompany thee?
said the prince.
I would have Sir James Lee and my squire, Master Gascoigne, if thou art so pleased to give them leave to go,
answered Miles.
So be it. We will stop at Mackworth Stairs for the night.
The barge landed at the west stairs of the Tower Wharf, and the whole party were received with more than usual civilities by the governor, who conducted them at once to the Tower, where Lord Falworth was lodged. Lady Falworth met them at the head of the stairs. Her eyes were very red, and her face pale, and as Miles raised her hand and set a long kiss upon it, her lips trembled, and she turned her face quickly away, pressing her handkerchief for one moment to her eyes. Poor lady, what agony of anxiety and dread did she not suffer for her boy's sake that day! Miles had not hidden both from her and his father that he must either win or die. As Miles turned from his mother, Prior Edward came out from the inner chamber, and was greeted warmly by him. The old priest had arrived in London only the day before, having come down from Crosby Priory to be with his friend's family during this their time of terrible anxiety. After a little while of general talk, the prince and his attendants retired, leaving the family together, only Sir James Lee and Gascoigne remaining behind. Many matters that had been discussed before were now finally settled, the chief of which was the disposition of Lady Falworth in case the battle should go against them. Then Miles took his leave, kissing his mother, who began crying, and comforting her with brave assurances. Prior Edward accompanied him as far as the head of the tower stairs, where Miles kneeled upon the stone steps, while the good priest blessed him and signed the cross upon his forehead. The prince was waiting in the walled garden adjoining, and as they rode back again up the river to Scotland Yard, all were thoughtful and serious, even Poins and Vere's merry tongues being stilled from their usual quips and jesting. It was about the quarter of the hour before 11 o'clock when Miles, with Gascoigne, set forth for the lists. The Prince of Wales, together with most of his court, had already gone on to Smithfield, leaving behind him 6 young knights of his household, to act as escort to the young champion. Then at last the order to horse was given. The great gate swung open, and out they rode, clattering and jingling, the sunlight gleaming and flaming and flashing upon their polished armor. They drew rein to the right, and so rode in a little cloud of dust along the Strand Street towards London town, with the breeze blowing merrily, and the sunlight shining as sweetly and blithesomely as though they were riding to a wedding rather than to a grim and dreadful ordeal that meant either victory or death. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Men of Iron by Howard Pyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the days of King Edward III, a code of laws relating to trial by battle had been compiled for one of his sons, Thomas of Woodstock. In this work each and every detail, to the most minute, had been arranged and fixed, and from that time judicial combats had been regulated in accordance with its mandates. It was in obedience to this code that Miles Falworth appeared at the east gate of the lists, the east gate being assigned by law to the challenger, clad in full armor of proof, attended by Gascoigne, and accompanied by 2 of the young knights who had acted as his escort from Scotland Yard. At the barriers he was met by the attorney Willingwood, the chief lawyer who had conducted the Falworth case before the High Court of Chivalry, and who was to attend him during the administration of the oaths before the king. As Miles presented himself at the gate, he was met by the constable, the marshal, and their immediate attendants. The constable, laying his hand upon the bridle rein, said in a loud voice,
"Stand, Sir Knight, and tell me why thou art come, thus armed, to the gates of the lists. What is thy name? Wherefore art thou come?"
I am Miles Falworth, a knight of the Bath by grace of his Majesty King Henry the Fourth and by his creation, and do come hither to defend my challenge upon the body of William Bushy Brockhurst, Earl of Alban, proclaiming him an unknightly knight and a false and perjured liar, in that he hath accused Gilbert Reginald, Lord Falworth, of treason against our beloved lord, his Majesty the King, and may God defend the right.
Miles answered. As he ended speaking, the constable advanced close to his side, and formally raising the umbril of the helmet, looked him in the face. Thereupon, having approved his identity, he ordered the gates to be opened, and bade Miles enter the lists with his squire and his friends. At the south side of the lists a raised scaffolding had been built for the king and those who looked on. It was not unlike that which had been erected at Devlen Castle, when Miles had first jousted as belted knight. Here were the same raised seat for the king, the tapestries, the hangings, the fluttering pennons, and the royal standard floating above. Only here were no fair-faced ladies looking down upon him, but instead stern-browed lords and knights in armor and squires. And here were no merry laughing, and buzz of talk, and flutter of fans and kerchiefs, but all was very quiet and serious. Miles riding upon his horse, with Gascoyne holding the bridle rein, and his attorney walking beside him, with his hand upon the stirrups, followed the constable across the lists to an open space in front of the seat where the king sat. Then, having reached his appointed station, he stopped, and the constable, advancing to the foot of the stairway that led to the dais above, announced in a loud voice that the challenger had entered the lists.
"Then call the defendant straightway,"
said the king,
"for noon draweth nigh."
The day was very warm, and the sun, bright and unclouded, shone fiercely down upon the open lists. Perhaps few men nowadays could bear the scorching heat of iron plates, such as Miles wore, from which the body was only protected by a leathern jacket and hose. But men's bodies in those days were tougher and more seasoned to hardships of weather than they are in these our times. Miles thought no more of the burning iron plates that encased him than a modern soldier thinks of his dress uniform in warm weather. Nevertheless, he raised the umbril of his helmet to cool his face as he waited the coming of his opponent. He turned his eyes upward to the row of seats on the scaffolding above, and even in the restless, bewildering multitude of strange faces turned towards him, recognized those that he knew, the Prince of Wales, his companions of the Scotland Yard household, the Duke of Clarence, the Bishop of Winchester, and some of the noblemen of the Earl of Mackworth's party, who had been buzzing about the prince for the past month or so. But his glance swept over all these, rather perceiving than seeing them, and then rested upon a square box-like compartment, not unlike a prisoner's dock in the courtroom of our day, for in the box sat his father, with the Earl of Mackworth upon one side, and Sir James Lee upon the other. The blind man's face was very pale, but still wore its usual expression of calm serenity, the calm serenity of a blind face. The Earl was also very pale, and he kept his eyes fixed steadfastly upon Miles, with a keen and searching look, as though to pierce to the very bottom of the young man's heart, and discover if indeed not one little fragment of dry rot of fear or uncertainty tainted the solid courage of his knighthood. Then he heard the criers calling the defendant at the four corners of the list.
"Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, William Bushy Brockhurst, Earl of Alban, come to this combat in which you be enterprised this day to discharge your sureties before the king, the constable, and the marshal, and to encounter in your defense Miles Falworth, knight, the accepted champion upon behalf of Gilbert Reginald Falworth, the challenger. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. Let the defendant come.
So they continued calling, until, by the sudden turning of all faces, Miles knew that his enemy was at hand. Then presently he saw the Earl and his attendants enter the outer gate at the west end of the barrier. He saw the constable and marshal meet him. He saw the formal words of greeting pass. He saw the constable raise the umbril of the helmet. Then the gate opened, and the Earl of Alban entered, clad cap a pie, in a full suit of magnificent Milan armor, without jupon or adornment of any kind. As he approached across the lists, Miles closed the umbril of his helmet, and then sat quite still and motionless, for the time was come. So he sat, erect and motionless as a statue of iron, half hearing the reading of the long, intricately worded bills, absorbed in many thoughts of past and present things. At last the reading ended, and then he calmly and composedly obeyed, under the direction of his attorney, the several forms and ceremonies that followed, answered the various official questions, took the various oaths. Then Gascoyne, leading the horse by the bridle rein, conducted him back to his station at the east end of the lists. As the faithful friend and squire made one last and searching examination of arms and armor, the marshal and the clerk came to the young champion, and administered the final oath by which he swore that he carried no concealed weapons. The weapons allowed by the High Court were then measured and attested. They consisted of the long sword, the short sword, the dagger, the mace, and a weapon known as the hand gisarm, or glavelot, a heavy sword-like blade 8 palms long, a palm in breadth, and riveted to a stout handle of wood 3 feet long. The usual lance had not been included in the list of arms, the hand gisarm being substituted in its place. It was a fearful and murderous weapon, though cumbersome, unhandy, and ill adapted for quick or dexterous stroke. Nevertheless, the Earl of Alban had petitioned the king to have it included in the list, and in answer to the king's express desire, the court had adopted it in the stead of the lance, yielding thus much to the royal wishes. Nor was it a small concession. The hand gisarm had been a weapon very much in vogue in King Richard's day, and was now nearly, if not entirely, out of fashion with the younger generation of warriors. The Earl of Alban was, of course, well used to the blade. With Miles it was strange and new, either for attack or in defense. With the administration of the final oath and the examination of the weapons, the preliminary ceremonies came to an end, and presently Miles heard the criers calling to clear the lists. As those around him moved to withdraw, the young knight drew off his mailed gauntlet, and gave Gascoyne's hand one last final clasp, strong, earnest, and intense, with the close friendship of young manhood. And poor Gascoyne looked up at him with a face ghastly white. Then all were gone. The gates of the principal list and that of the false list were closed clashing, and Miles was alone face to face with his mortal enemy. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Men of Iron by Howard Pyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There was a little while of restless, rustling silence, during which the constable took his place in the seat appointed for him directly in front of and below the king's throne. A moment or two when even the restlessness and the rustling were quieted, and then the king leaned forward and spoke to the constable, who immediately called out in a loud, clear voice,
"Let them go."
Then again,
"Let them go."
Then for the third and last time,
"Let them go and do their endeavor in God's name."
At this third command, the combatants, each of whom had till that moment been sitting as motionless as a statue of iron, tightened rein, and rode slowly and deliberately forward without haste, yet without hesitation, until they met in the very middle of the lists. In the battle which followed, Myles fought with the long sword, the Earl with the hand gisarm for which he had asked. The moment they met, the combat was opened, and for a time nothing was heard but the thunderous clashing and clamor of blows, now and then beating intermittently, now and then pausing. Occasionally, as the combatants spurred together, checked, wheeled, and recovered, they would be hidden for a moment in a misty veil of dust, which, again drifting down the wind, perhaps revealed them drawn a little apart, resting their panting horses. Then again they would spur together, striking as they passed, wheeling and striking again. Upon the scaffolding all was still, only now and then for the buzz of muffled exclamations or applause of those who looked on. Mostly the applause was from Myles's friends, for from the very first he showed and steadily maintained his advantage over the older man.
"Ha! Well struck! Well recovered!"
"Look ye, the sword bit that time." "Nay, look, saw ye him pass the point of the gisarm?"
Then,
"Falworth! Falworth!"
as some more than usually skilful stroke or parry occurred. Meantime Myles's father sat straining his sightless eyeballs, as though to pierce his body's darkness with one ray of light that would show him how his boy held his own in the fight, and Lord Mackworth, leaning with his lips close to the blind man's ear, told him point by point how the battle stood.
"Fear not, Gilbert,"
said he at each pause in the fight.
"he holdeth his own right well."
Then, after a while,
"God is with us, Gilbert. Alban is twice wounded, and his horse faileth. One little while longer, and the victory is ours."
A longer and more continuous interval of combat followed this last assurance, during which Myles drove the assault fiercely and unrelentingly, as though to overbear his enemy by the very power and violence of the blows he delivered. The Earl defended himself desperately, but was borne back, farther and farther. Every nerve of those who looked on was stretched to breathless tensity, when, almost as his enemy was against the barriers, Myles paused and rested.
"Out upon it!"
exclaimed the Earl of Mackworth, almost shrilly in his excitement, as the sudden lull followed the crashing of blows.
"Why doth the boy spare him? That is thrice he hath given him grace to recover, and he had pushed to battle that time he had driven him back against the barriers."
It was as the Earl had said. Myles had 3 times given his enemy grace when victory was almost in his very grasp. He had 3 times spared him, in spite of all he and those dear to him must suffer should his cruel and merciless enemy gain the victory. It was a false and foolish generosity, partly the fault of his impulsive youth, more largely of his romantic training in the artificial code of French chivalry. He felt that the battle was his, and so he gave his enemy these 3 chances to recover, as some chevalier or knight-errant of romance might have done, instead of pushing the combat to a mercifully speedy end, and his foolish generosity cost him dear. In the momentary pause that had thus stirred the Earl of Mackworth to a sudden outbreak, the Earl of Alban sat upon his panting, sweating war-horse, facing his powerful young enemy at about 12 paces distant. He sat as still as a rock, holding his gisarm poised in front of him. He had, as the Earl of Mackworth had said, been wounded twice, and each time with the point of the sword, so much more dangerous than a direct cut with the weapon. One wound was beneath his armor, and no one but he knew how serious it might be. The other was under the overlapping of the epauhere, and from it a finger's breadth of blood ran straight down his side and over the housings of his horse. From without, the still motionless iron figure appeared calm and expressionless. Within, who knows what consuming blasts of hate, rage, and despair swept his heart as with a fiery whirlwind. As Miles looked at the motionless, bleeding figure, his breast swelled with pity.
"My lord,"
said he,
"thou art sore wounded, and the fight is against thee. Wilt thou not yield thee?"
No one but that other heard the speech, and no one but Miles heard the answer that came back, hollow, cavernous.
"Never, thou dog! Never!"
Then, in an instant, as quick as a flash, his enemy spurred straight upon Miles, and as he spurred, he struck a last desperate, swinging blow, in which he threw in one final effort all the strength of hate, of fury, and of despair. Miles whirled his horse backward, warding the blow with his shield as he did so. The blade glanced from the smooth face of the shield, and, whether by mistake or not, fell straight and true, and with almost undiminished force, upon the neck of Miles' war horse, and just behind the ears. The animal staggered forward, and then fell upon its knees, and at the same instant the other, as though by the impetus of the rush, dashed full upon it with all the momentum lent by the weight of iron it carried. The shock was irresistible, and the stunned and wounded horse was flung upon the ground, rolling over and over. As his horse fell, Miles wrenched one of his feet out of the stirrup. The other caught for an instant, and he was flung headlong with stunning violence, his armor crashing as he fell. In the cloud of dust that arose, no one could see just what happened, but that what was done deliberately, no one doubted. The Earl, at once checking and spurring his foaming charger, drove the iron-shod war-horse directly over Miles' prostrate body. Then, checking him fiercely with the curb, reined him back, the hoofs clashing and crashing over the figure beneath. So he had ridden over the father at York, and so he rode over the son at Smithfield. Miles, as he lay prostrate and half stunned by his fall, had seen his enemy thus driving his rearing horse down upon him, but was not able to defend himself. A fallen knight in full armor was utterly powerless to rise without assistance. Miles lay helpless in the clutch of the very iron that was his defense. He closed his eyes involuntarily, and then horse and rider were upon him. There was a deafening, sparkling crash, a glimmering faintness, then another crash as the horse was reined furiously back again, and then a humming stillness. In a moment, upon the scaffolding, all was a tumult of uproar and confusion, shouting and gesticulation. Only the king sat calm, sullen, impassive. The Earl wheeled his horse, and sat for a moment or two, as though to make quite sure that he knew the king's mind. The blow that had been given was foul, unknightly, but the king gave no sign either of acquiescence or rebuke. He had willed that Miles was to die. Then the Earl turned again, and rode deliberately up to his prostrate enemy. When Miles opened his eyes after that moment of stunning silence, it was to see the other looming above him on his war-horse, swinging his gisarm for one last mortal blow, pitiless, merciless. The sight of that looming peril brought back Miles' wandering senses like a flash of lightning. He flung up his shield, and met the blow even as it descended, turning it aside. It only protracted the end. Once more the Earl of Alban raised the gisarm, swinging it twice around his head before he struck. This time, though the shield glanced it, the blow fell upon the shoulder-piece, biting through the steel plate and leathern jack beneath, even to the bone. Then Myles covered his head with his shield as a last protecting chance for life. For the third time the Earl swung the blade, flashing, and then it fell straight and true upon the defenseless body, just below the left arm, biting deep through the armor plates. For an instant the blade stuck fast, and that instant was Myles's salvation. Under the agony of the blow he gave a muffled cry, and almost instinctively grasped the shaft of the weapon with both hands. Had the Earl let go his end of the weapon, he would have won the battle at his leisure, and most easily. As it was, he struggled violently to wrench the gisarm away from Myles. In that short, fierce struggle, Myles was dragged to his knees, and then, still holding the weapon with one hand, he clutched the trappings of the Earl's horse with the other. The next moment he was upon his feet. The other struggled to thrust him away, but Myles, letting go the gisarm, which he held with his left hand, clutched him tightly by the sword belt in the intense, vice-like grip of despair. In vain the Earl strove to beat him loose with the shaft of the gisarm. In vain he spurred and reared his horse to shake him off. Myles held him tight, in spite of all his struggles. He felt neither the streaming blood nor the throbbing agony of his wounds. Every faculty of soul, mind, body, every power of life, was centered in one intense, burning effort. He neither felt, thought, nor reasoned, but clutching, with the blindness of instinct, the heavy spiked iron-headed mace that hung at the Earl's saddle-bow, he gave it one tremendous wrench that snapped the plaited leather thongs that held it as though they were skeins of thread. Then, grinding his teeth as with a spasm, he struck as he had never struck before, once, twice, thrice, full upon the front of the helmet. Crash, crash, and then, even as the Earl toppled sidelong, crash, and the iron plates split and crackled under the third blow. Myles had one flashing glimpse of an awful face, and then the saddle was empty. Then, as he held tight to the horse, panting, dizzy, sick to death, he felt the hot blood gushing from his side, filling his body armor, and staining the ground upon which he stood. Still he held tightly to the saddle bow of the fallen man's horse, until, through his glimmering sight, he saw the marshal, the lieutenant, and the attendants gather around him. He heard the marshal ask him, in a voice that sounded faint and distant, if he was dangerously wounded. He did not answer, and one of the attendants, leaping from his horse, opened the umbril of his helmet, disclosing the dull, hollow eyes, the ashy, colorless lips, and the waxy forehead, upon which stood great beads of sweat.
"Water! Water!"
he cried hoarsely.
"Give me to drink."
Then, quitting his hold upon the horse, he started blindly across the lists towards the gate of the barrier. A shadow that chilled his heart seemed to fall upon him.
"It is death,"
he muttered. Then he stopped, then swayed for an instant, and then toppled headlong, crashing as he fell. End of chapter 33. Conclusion of Men of Iron by Howard Pyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. But Myles was not dead. Those who had seen his face when the umbril of the helmet was raised, and then saw him fall as he tottered across the lists, had at first thought so. But his faintness was more from loss of blood, and the sudden unstringing of nerve and sense from the intense, furious strain of the last few moments of battle, than from the vital nature of the wound. Indeed, after Miles had been carried out of the lists and laid upon the ground in the shade between the barriers, Master Thomas, the prince's barber surgeon, having examined the wounds, declared that he might be even carried on a covered litter to Scotland Yard without serious danger. The prince was extremely desirous of having him under his care, and so the venture was tried. Miles was carried to Scotland Yard, and perhaps was none the worse therefore. The prince, the Earl of Mackworth, and 2 or 3 others stood silently watching as the worthy shaver and leecher, assisted by his apprentice and Gascoigne, washed and bathed the great gaping wound in the side, and bound it with linen bandages. Miles lay with closed eyelids, still pallid, weak as a little child. Presently he opened his eyes and turned them, dull and languid, to the prince.
"What hath happed, my father, my lord?"
said he, in a faint whispering voice.
"Thou hast saved his life and honour, Miles,"
the prince answered.
"He is here now, and thy mother hath been sent for, and cometh anon with the priest who was with them this morn."
Miles dropped his eyelids again. His lips moved, but he made no sound, and then 2 bright tears trickled across his white cheek.
"He maketh a woman of me,"
the prince muttered through his teeth, and then, swinging on his heel, he stood for a long time looking out of the window into the garden beneath.
"May I see my father?"
said Miles presently, without opening his eyes. The prince turned around and looked inquiringly at the surgeon. The good man shook his head.
"Not today,"
said he.
"Haply tomorrow he may see him and his mother. The bleeding is but new staunched, and such matters as seeing his father and mother may make the heart to swell, and so maybe the wound burst afresh and he die. And he would hope to live, he must rest quiet until tomorrow day."
But though Miles' wound was not mortal, it was very serious. The fever which followed lingered longer than common, perhaps because of the hot weather, and the days stretched to weeks, and the weeks to months. And still he lay there, nursed by his mother and Gascoigne and Prior Edward, and now and again by Sir James Lee. One day, a little before the good priest returned to St. Mary's Priory, as he sat by Miles' bedside, his hands folded and his sight turned inward, the young man suddenly said,
"Tell me, Holy Father, is it always wrong for man to slay man?"
The good priest sat silent for so long a time that Miles began to think he had not heard the question, but by and by he answered, almost with a sigh.
"It is a hard question, my son. But I must in truth say, meseems it is not always wrong."
"Sir,"
said Miles,
"I have been in battle when men were slain, but never did I think thereon as I have upon this matter. Did I sin in so slaying my father's enemy?"
"Nay,"
said Prior Edward quietly,
"thou didst not sin. It was for others thou didst fight, my son, and for others it is pardonable to do battle. Had it been in thine own quarrel, it might haply have been more hard to have answered thee."
Who can gainsay, even in these days of light, the truth of this, that the good priest said to the sick lad, so far away in the past? One day the Earl of Mackworth came to visit Miles. At that time the young knight was mending, and was sitting propped up with pillows, and was wrapped in Sir James Lee's cloak, for the day was chilly. After a little time of talk, a pause of silence fell.
"My lord,"
said Miles suddenly,
"dost thou remember one part of a matter we spoke of when I first came from France?"
The Earl made no pretense of ignorance.
"I remember,"
said he quietly, looking straight into the young man's thin white face.
"And have I yet won the right to ask for the Lady Alistair Mowbray to wife?"
said Miles, the red rising faintly to his cheeks.
"Thou hast won it,"
said the Earl with a smile. Myles's eyes shone, and his lips trembled with the pang of sudden joy and triumph, for he was still very weak.
My lord,
said he presently,
belike thou camest here to see me for this very matter.
The Earl smiled again without answering, and Myles knew that he had guessed aright. He reached out one of his weak, pallid hands from beneath the cloak. The Earl of Mackworth took it with a firm pressure, then instantly quitting it again, rose, as if ashamed of his emotion, stamped his feet, as though in pretence of being chilled, and then crossed the room to where the fire crackled brightly in the great stone fireplace. Little else remains to be told. Only a few loose strands to tie, and the story is complete. Though Lord Falworth was saved from death at the block, though his honour was cleansed from stain, he was yet as poor and needy as ever. The king, in spite of all the pressure brought to bear upon him, refused to restore the estates of Falworth and Easterbridge, the latter of which had again reverted to the crown upon the death of the Earl of Alban without issue, upon the grounds that they had been forfeited, not because of the attaint of treason, but because of Lord Falworth having refused to respond to the citation of the courts. So the business dragged along for month after month, until in January the king died suddenly in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster. Then matters went smoothly enough, and Falworth and Mackworth swam upon the flood tide of fortune. So Myles was married, for how else should the story end? And one day he brought his beautiful young wife home to Falworth Castle, which his father had given him for his own, and at the gateway of which he was met by Sir James Lee, and by the newly knighted Sir Francis Gascoigne. One day, soon after this home-coming, as he stood with her at an open window into which came blowing the pleasant May-time breeze, he suddenly said,
What didst thou think of me when I first fell almost into thy lap like an apple from heaven?
I thought thou wert a great good-hearted boy, as I think thou art now.
It was thou thoughtest me so then. What a very fool I must have looked to thee when I so clumsily besought thee for thy favour for my jousting at Devlin. Did I not so?
Thou didst look to me the most noble, handsome young knight that did ever live. Thou didst look to me, Sir Galahad, as they did call thee, withouten taint or stain,
said she, twisting his strong sinewy fingers in and out. Myles did not even smile in answer, but looked at his wife with such a look that she blushed a rosy red. Then, laughing, she slipped from his hold, and before he could catch her again, was gone. I am glad that he was to be rich and happy, and honoured and beloved, after all his hard and noble fighting. End of conclusion. End of Men of Iron by Howard Pyle.